Hi, Wycliffe.
Hi, Mark.
So this is Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch speaking with...
I'm Wycliffe Muga of the Star newspaper in Kenya. I'm the weekend editor with the Star newspaper and also a long-time BBC World Service radio commentator.
And I am reaching you in Nairobi.
Oh,
correct?
Absolutely. Yes, right here in Nairobi. Sorry, forgot to mention that.
The magic of modern technology and Skype. We love Skype.
True.
Let's sort of dive right into things. So this is part of the Worldwise series. I write a blog about the UN and global affairs. You are a real reporter on the ground in Kenya and have your ears to the pavement, as they say. There's actually a lot of really interesting things happening in Kenya right now that involve Kenyan politics and regional politics in the Horn of Africa that deserve a lot of discussion, and we'll delve into all these really interesting topics. But I wanted to, kick things off, Wycliffe, by asking you, about sort of if Kenyans and if you are following U.S. politics very closely right now, if that Obama shine that I saw across the continent of Africa shortly after the 2008 elections is still there, if people are still deeply enthralled with him, there's obviously the historic family connection between Obama and Kenyan. So I just wanted to get your general perceptions on sort of, and your take on how Kenyans are experiencing the U.S. election.
Okay, I'd say there are two levels of this. At one level, of course, Obama is very popular in this country, and everyone is hoping, or very many people are hoping, that he will be re-elected. But even if he is not re-elected, I think his being elected in the first place said something quite wonderful about America and about American politics. No one would have believed it was possible, no one here anyway, before it happened. And the fact that it did demolished many stereotypes about America. Let me explain what I mean by stereotypes.
Go for it.
Very often when a Kenyan journalist, the sort who gets invited to a conference in America or to maybe even give a seminar at some American university, those are people who here in Kenya, in Nairobi, are used to being regarded as the elite. So when they go to a different country, a very small incidental racial incident can really color their views. Something like, why was I given the corner table in this restaurant when there were other seats? Or maybe a policeman stopped me and asked me to identify myself.
Has this happened to you?
And oddly enough, it has never happened to me personally. I've never been treated with anything but courtesy by policemen, as well as by every other American I've met. But there is one thing I should mention. Once or twice, when walking to wherever I was staying, from the train station late at night, say there was a white woman walking by herself, and I was walking by myself, usually she'll cross the road when she sees a black man coming. So I didn't even notice it till other African scholars on the programs which took me to the US over the years told me, have you noticed if there's a white woman coming towards you and you are on your own and you're obviously a black man, she will always cross the street? And when they mentioned it, I began to notice that it was true. But you can't call that discrimination in an insulting way. It might bother you that she thinks you're so dangerous she has to cross the road, but you can't say she has harmed you or offended you. I certainly don't take offense personally. But no policemen have ever stopped me. In fact, I ask policemen for directions all the time when I'm in the US. They're the best people to ask for directions.
Most of the time. Depends what city you're in.
Yes, I agree. I've been told that by Americans, that you're naive because you've only been to liberal places like Boston and New York and places on the West Coast. If you ever travel to the Deep South, you'd learn a lesson. But that lesson is still ahead of me.
Okay. So you're saying that singular event, the Obama election, sort of helped sort of change this perception?
Yes, primarily because in a country like ours, if you are from a minority community in a country like Kenya or most African countries, I'm told a country like Ghana is an exception, I've also heard Tanzania could be an exception. They have a very strong party there. South Africa may be another exception. They have a strong party, so that if within the party you come up, you can end up being the president or prime minister, as the case may be. But apart from such rare examples, unless you come from what we call a big tribe, meaning the people from your own tribal background form a solid majority who can work a deal with another big tribe, minorities never get elected. In fact, to us, the fact that Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister of India, is a Sikh, that's an amazing thing, because they're a clear minority in that country, and yet he is their Prime Minister. It would never happen in Kenya. So in any case, the fact that Obama got to be president at all, that says it all. And I think I speak for many Kenyans when I say this. It demolishes the myth that America is an intrinsically racial country. And even when Kenyans go abroad now, in the past, whenever a Kenyan journalist attended a seminar in the US, when he was talking about it to his friends, he'd always mention some racial incident as part of what happened. Nowadays, you hardly hear it, because it has gone a long way towards demystifying, if I may use that, and explaining that there may be Americans who, for whatever reason, are racist, but you can't say the majority are.
And I guess, how are people obsessing, or are you obsessing about sort of the U.S. election in ways that a lot of maybe political reporters here in the U.S. are? I mean, reading blogs like Nate Silver's 537 every day, constantly hitting like the refresh button. Is the level of detail that close, or are you just sort of kind of following the broad strokes?
Actually, it's a totally different perspective from here, and a very naive one, I think. In most of Africa, the assumption is if there's a Democrat in the White House, we will get more aid, they'll give us more money. If it's a Republican in the White House, we will get less. And even though the amount of aid given may not amount to very much, like Kenya, barely 5% of our annual budget is funded by the donor community. And that includes all the countries, the European Union countries, the US, and even the multilateral organizations. Even though it's a small part and we could easily manage without it, the focus is still there, that there's aid coming. Because for most of Africa, your country had been poor at some stage, needed lots of help from outside. So even when you don't really need help, the psychology of poverty is still with you, and you're asking, will we get more money? Now, the absurd thing about it is, Africa, and I think most of the world, has never received more money than under the PEPFAR program, the president's, President Bush's program. I forget what PEPFAR stands for. Yep. Yes.
It stands for the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief.
Yes.
It was President George W. Bush launched. This was like the biggest expansion of U.S. global health spending in sort of modern history, and it was a President Bush's signature achievement in Africa, at least.
And it wasn't just the biggest in public health; it was the biggest ever in anything, at least for Kenya. Mm-hmm. So the most money we ever got, and in a specific area where we were helpless on our own. There was no question that countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Malawi could possibly have ramped up spending on public health on a scale required to meet the challenges which AIDS and HIV posed. Help had to come from somewhere, and it came from a Republican president. So it just shows how little we understand of how American politics really work. But then at the same time, we often say Americans don't understand how our politics works either.
Well, we're hoping after this conversation, many more Americans will have a better understanding of how Kenyan politics work, which sounds like this is a great segue to ask you about Kenyan politics. Now, so maybe a good starting point to get into this conversation, and you can give us a deeper background if you want, is to talk a little bit about the 2007-2008 crisis, where there was I will let you explain it all, but the short story is there was a disputed election in the ensuing chaos, over 1,000 people were killed in protests, some that took on pretty ugly sectarian strands. And I do know that there is a Kenyan election coming up, and there's lots of interesting international implications to this election, also regional implications, and of course national implications. So I will just sort of maybe pass the baton to you, Wycliffe, to have you maybe take us back a little bit, I think, to those dark days in 07, 08, to help maybe give us a better understanding of where we are today.
Thank you, Mark. Now, the heart of it, the essence of it, is that Kenya, like most African countries, had for many years had what you would call an imperial presidency. The president appointed all the judges, the president appointed all the civil servants, the president appointed his cabinet. The president could appoint just about anyone who held a job with real authority in the country. Now, when you have a situation like that, it means everything ultimately starts and ends with who is president. So that creates a form of politics in which it's literally a life and death matter, whether the president likes you or likes your tribe or doesn't like you or doesn't like your tribe. Politicians could be detained without trial for indefinite periods. At the same time, whether a road was built here or whether a new and better water supply was arranged in that other place, whether there were clinics, whether there were schools, if you were not on the president's side, if he saw you or your community as opposing him and his community, he could deny you all these things. So a lot of thinking went into how can we either get one of our tribesmen to be president, or if we can't get one of our own to be president, how can we make sure that we supported the right person who ends up being president? So all our politics, everything, all life and death issues revolve around who will be the next president of Kenya. A very unhealthy situation. And the reason for this is that we did not have independent institutions. They had all been destroyed between independence in 1964 and say by some time in the late 1970s, early 1980s. The president's founding president and the president who came after him all made sure that they had all power gathered into their hands. Now, the election itself should never have produced that kind of violence if we had independent institutions. But our electoral commission, the Electoral Commission of Kenya, ECK, was full of presidential appointees who would more or less be expected to do what they are told, and therefore were not trusted, not really. At the same time, we had a court, the High Court, the highest court we had. We didn't have a Supreme Court then. We had the Court of Appeal as the highest court, full of presidential appointees as well. So no one was going to trust the outcome to the Court of Appeal. Once the chairman of the Electoral Commission himself confessed that there's been so much chaos in this election, so much mischief in the counting, I honestly don't know who won. In the US, when you had an election which was a statistical tie, that's Al Gore and President George W. Bush, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decision didn't please everyone, but you respect your Supreme Court, so you could live with it. We didn't have that option. So once there was a disputed election, no one was going to go to court. So each side was essentially declaring victory. There was a standoff. And in this last part, I cannot speak with authority because I wasn't there. I was living in the coastal city of Mombasa, which didn't have very much violence. But who orchestrated violence? Who supplied the machetes which were used? It was all based on very crude weapons. Who transported the militias? That we will only know when the ICC tries these people. What we do know is that there was violence on a scale that was totally unprecedented, and it was various tribes fighting various other tribes. Essentially, it boiled down to the tribes of Western Kenya, the Kalenjin, the Luo, the Luya, and to a smaller extent the Kisi, fighting against those who were from Central Kenya. Now, it was not a fight of two large militias, no. If you're from Central Kenya and happen to be in Western Kenya at the time, you might get killed. Likewise, if you're from Western Kenya and you happen to be in Central Kenya at that time, you might easily get killed. And often, just as happened in Rwanda, attacked by your neighbors and having your goods looted by your neighbors. There are cases of heroic people who defended their neighbors against their own tribesmen, but by and large it was our time of national shame, and it is something which we are still trying to come to grips with. So it and sorry, go on.
So I guess into this chaos and into this violence, which at least from an outsider was really shocking to the world. I mean, I follow these issues fairly closely, didn't see this coming, and in part because Kenya does have this reputation as being kind of like the regional power, the economic hub, and one would expect that with that power comes a degree of stability. So I'm reading Kofi Annan's memoirs. I haven't finished it, but I did get to the part where he saves Kenya, and I wanted to, or at least that's almost how he presents it. And I must say it does seem like a pretty credible case. So I wanted to ask you about this. So in the midst of this violence, you have Kofi Annan sort of comes swooping in under the rubric of the elders, and he's supported by some other African leaders with moral and political clout. How would you sort of judge his role, and how do Kenyans in general judge sort of his role in sort of trying to mediate this conflict? Because at this point, about over 1,000 people had been killed, but it seems as if it could have gotten much, much worse, and it didn't.
No, it didn't, and you have to bear in mind that the fighting stopped pending a resolution from the moment Kofi Annan arrived. But although he's a very astute diplomat and he was very respected and played a key role, he didn't really have the muscle to arm twist anyone. You essentially had to force the two sides to come to a settlement which was unsatisfactory to both sides, because each side thought and believed they had won, but which was the only way the country could be allowed to move forward. Actually, it was, to my mind, it was Condoleezza Rice and George W. Bush who saved Kenya. Mm-hmm. A lot happened behind the scenes. Neither of them have admitted it in their memoirs or biographies, but you need people who can make credible threats to the leaders. Now, I'll tell you something which makes Kenyan leaders vulnerable to outside influence. Almost all of them, by the time they rise to power, have done something wrong somewhere, which if it was to come out, it could be that they've got millions of dollars in foreign accounts. It could be that there's something which they did within Kenya. They had a hand in some assassination which no one knows about. And we usually assume that the Americans know everything. The CIA is all powerful. It's nonsense, but people believe that. So,
so that's interesting.
I was just going to finish off and say you needed credible force, people who could say, and I believe Condoleezza Rice said this plainly, that if you do not find a solution will be found for you. And the rumor in newsrooms at that time was that the solution would be that a third person would be brought in, and both the candidates who are fighting over the presidency would be forced to step aside somehow or other.
Interesting. So in Kofi, in Annan's memoir, so he got the initial agreement first from the challenger, from Odinga, and then went to Kibaki's residence palace, whatever, and sat down with him in a room one-on-one and said, everyone is behind this except you. I have basically I have Condoleezza Rice on speed dial. I'm going to be forced to tell her and President Bush that you rejected this deal that everyone else agreed to. And that's, as you said, that's finally what got him to relent.
Yes, you have to remember Desmond Tutu, another man very respected in Africa, was the first to come. Kibaki's side wouldn't even listen to him. They said, welcome to Kenya. Please go and enjoy a visit to the game parks. Visit church leaders, but we have no problem here. We've had an election, we have a winner, and we'll settle it internally. John Kufuor, the former president of Ghana, again a very respected figure, he came too. The Kibaki side didn't listen to him because they were sitting pretty in State House. Odinga was desperate for a deal. What's his name? Cyril Ramaphosa, I forget if that's how his name is said. A major South African figure. He came too. No one listened to him. So the same fate might well have met Kofi Annan if it wasn't that by that time the U.S. State Department and people like Condoleezza Rice and George W. Bush had realized, hey, if we don't solve this thing, our geostrategic interests are at stake here. We have too much invested. And the U.S. ambassador of the time called his staff. He himself told me this, Ambassador Michael Ranneberger, he's since left, of course, and said he called his staff and said to them, in case any of you are wondering how is the U.S. going to react to this, what are the plans for evacuation? Excuse me. He said, there are no plans for evacuation. We are not closing the embassy. The U.S. is not retreating. So he said that knowing very well that this word would leak out, that we know there has to be a solution to this. It's going to be solved. There's no question of letting Kenya go the way of Rwanda in 1994. And there's no use pretending it couldn't have happened. It could have happened. Once you have a certain percentage of the people in your country really desperately poor, people who have little to lose, a very small middle class which is invested in stability, the poor can very easily be manipulated. And once the fighting starts, the spiral of revenge killings just goes on and on. So I think that's a rare case. And I think Condoleezza Rice says it in her memoirs, that it's one of the cases where she was proud of the use of U.S. power. She doesn't tell everything, but those who know or claim to know what happened say that but for her and George W. Bush stepping in forcefully, Kofi Annan would not have achieved very much.
Mm-hmm. You know, so what you're saying reminds me, and maybe pulling back to our first conversation about Obama, reminds me of a story. I was in Ethiopia maybe 2 weeks after the 2008 election, and I was talking to people, about what they think of Obama and their election, and obviously everyone was very clearly overjoyed and happy with Obama's election for the reasons you talked about earlier. But one young woman's comment really stands out and sticks with me to this day. She's like, yeah, I love Obama, but we need more John McCains in Africa. We need more people who will lose an election gracefully and not start sort of a war or conflict over it. And your stories sort of reminds me of that. Of that conversation, which was pretty powerful at the time.
It was, and it should be powerful even now, because we are just about to go into another election. There will be only one winner. There will be at least 3 people who, despite losing, have overwhelming influence in their quarter of the country. They have a big say. It's like some of the Italian politicians I've read about who are very powerful in one region. They more or less decide who gets what, who gets elected to what. Mm-hmm. But they don't have the strength or the appeal to win national elections. So
now, correct me if I'm wrong, but are not at least two of the potentially leading candidates also wanted by the International Criminal Court?
Not only are they wanted by the International Criminal Court, but they are Kenyans. Kenyans, and in some cases Kenyans said to have been formally close to them, now in hiding in some city or other in Europe, waiting to give evidence against them. People who are waiting to say, it's this man. There are 2 key characters. There are 4 people in total, and one of them, incidentally, is the head of the civil service. The sort of person you'd think would never be caught up in something like this, but apparently he was. And he's a former ambassador. We refer to him as Ambassador Francis Mudaura, now retired, semi-retired. He and one radio journalist and 2 leading politicians, Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, are all waiting to prove their innocence at the ICC because enough evidence has been found to justify putting them through a full trial. Now, this is a painful lesson to any Kenyan politician because there are people waiting to testify against them, and this is the key thing, are people who claim that they sent mobs and they organized militias and they were responsible for this massacre and they were responsible for that church being burned. That's a real nightmare. Even if you're found innocent, all these people have children, they have family, and all that they are seeing is that they are monsters. They are to be compared with the genocidal group in Rwanda. So it's actually a pretty big thing, and many people have asked, why don't they give up their political ambitions for now? Why don't they wait until they're cleared by the ICC before running for office? But one explanation I've heard repeatedly is what we call the Omar Bashir option, that if the president of Sudan had not been president, whoever was president would have long given him up. That when the ICC is after you, the only safe place is the presidency. So,
well, what's so interesting about this is how this case actually got to the ICC is pretty interesting. I mean, the first option was was local courts, the local judicial system, right? And the sort of Annan mediated resolution gave rise to the Waukee Commission, right? This jurist who was going to try to find out who was most responsible for these crimes, but that sort of local Kenyan-led process was effectively squashed by the parliament. So the ICC, as its court of last resort, as they call themselves, said, well, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it. And it seems as if the Kenyan political system almost undermined itself by not letting the judicial process play out effectively at the local level.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And the reason for this failure is that they did not understand the ICC. As you said earlier, Kenya is thought of, and we Kenyans were used to thinking of ourselves as a modern state, a state with institutions which worked. They didn't really work, but we assumed they did work. And the ICC was for warlords from the Congo and for people who are involved in the fighting in Darfur and things like those. So none of these political leaders, or even the journalist who was involved, and even some of those who were found not to have too much evidence against them, all of them have been educated abroad in the US or UK and elsewhere. They are all of them technocrats who, in some cases, have run successful businesses. They are people who've lived all their lives peacefully. No one has ever accused them before of having blood on their hands. Someone like Ambassador Mudaura, the former head of the civil service, when his name was first mentioned, there was total disbelief. Such a gentleman, such a polished man. How is it possible anyone can accuse him of having organized militias to go and slaughter fellow Kenyans, and to slaughter them not where the real fighting was, but on a separate location? So no one really understood what the threat of the ICC was. They thought if we postpone, this is just my reading of it, if we postpone the local option, the ICC option will come up in another 10 years, and it's so easy to defend ourselves in a foreign court. What do they know about what happened in Kenya? And then, to everyone's surprise, evidence which has been collected by various non-governmental organizations and the Kenya Human Rights Commission finds its way to the ICC, is considered credible, and summons are issued. That was a huge shock. And I think that's another thing which guarantees we are not likely to have. Okay, there's always a certain amount of violence in Kenyan elections, but nothing involving deaths of dozens or hundreds of people again. Because people now know that if you get some hooligans, and it usually is hooligans or street gangs, to do your dirty work for you during an election, after that election, you've given them a ticket to a life in Europe, because these guys who are waiting to give evidence, they're never coming back to Kenya. Now, you must know, Mark, that Africans, and specifically West Africans, try and swim the Mediterranean or go in some leaky boats trying to get to Europe. Africans risk their lives for a chance to live in Europe. Now, if you take a street hooligan who doesn't have much here, and you tell him, go and kill, or lead one of your gangs band, kill this group, you've given him a license to a legitimate life in Europe, because he'll go to whatever court and offer evidence against you in return for a chance to live there, because, of course, if he came to Kenya, he'd be killed immediately. Mm-hmm. So this is what is scary. The fact that what you do in Kenya will be judged by a jurisdiction over which you have no control, and by judges whom you did not appoint. I think leading politicians would think twice before ever organizing anything of that kind.
So that's a really, really interesting and really important point you bring up. One of the big debates surrounding the International Criminal Court is this question of whether or not it actually can deter future war crimes. We know that it can prosecute people, but for committing war crimes, but ultimately, like the liberal project, as it were, is to prevent future crimes against humanity from happening. And you're sort of offering, I guess, evidence in support of the contention that the ICC can, and in your case, in your example, really is helping to deter future election-related violence in Kenya, and that's just a really interesting and important point.
And not just in Kenya. The sort of people who are going to the ICC are well known. Someone like Ambassador Mudaura served in Belgium. He may have served at the Court of St. James, I can't remember. He served in the East African Community. So there are many African statesmen, many African politicians who know him. So when they hear that that Kenyan is answering charges of crimes against humanity before the International Criminal Court for what is claimed to have been his role in orchestrating and supporting the post-election violence of 2007, it's a lesson to them too, that if anything of that sort happens in their countries, they might find themselves answering before, as I said, a court which they cannot influence. And that's a lesson they are not likely to forget in a hurry. I certainly had never thought that any of those people, not that I know them personally, but they are all famous men in this country, would one day, first I didn't expect they'd ever be accused. That in itself came as a surprise to me, because I thought they were politicians or leaders, but just playing by the rules. I never thought anyone would accuse someone like Uhuru Kenyatta of crime. He's the only one I've met of the four, of crimes against humanity. But now that's his nightmare.
He's the deputy prime minister, right? He's a really high-ranking official.
He was even a presidential candidate who might have won in 2002. He and his family have been prominent in Kenya for a very long time. This is a huge blow to him. This is a huge blow to his family.
And so just to maybe wrap up this part of the conversation, the elections are in this spring, correct?
Yes, in March 2013.
Okay, in March, and in the meantime, the ICC proceedings, I think, are like the first sort of court appearances are around that time for these people as well. These dates can kind of get shifted around, but that sort of that overlap, I think, is really interesting. Will be an interesting story to watch.
It's something which we analyze in the press here all the time. What if Uhuru Kenyatta wins? And our current laws require him to be sworn in here in Kenya under certain circumstances at a certain time. I don't know if your average listener won't know this, but the last time we had a president sworn in, President Kibaki was sworn in the evening in a protected area where only his supporters are allowed, not in a large public gathering as we were used to, because the opposition was going to court and there were judges who were suspected might willingly hand down a ruling saying he cannot be sworn in until this matter is taken through the court system. And in that case, we'd have had no president for goodness knows how long. So it was not a very dignified swearing in for a man who in 2002 the country was delirious when he was elected. People expected so much. To some extent, in my judgment anyway, he has delivered. But it will always be a mark against him that the manner in which he won his second term and the way in which he had to be sworn in. It was not what one would have expected of President Mwai Kibaki.
I wanted to turn now to Kenya's role in regional politics in the Horn of Africa and in Somalia in particular, which is a really big story internationally. The short story is that I'm sure viewers know Somalia has for a very, very long time been without an effective government, and the Al-Qaeda affiliated, linked, inspired by group Al-Shabaab controlled large swaths of Somali territory, and into this mix, I guess it was about a year ago, right? The Kenyan military, maybe even less than a year ago, decided to sort of launch sort of cross-border attacks against Al-Shabaab targets. And I guess this was in response to some very high-profile kidnappings of tourists in Kenya by Al-Shabaab, but also some terrorist attacks as well. So maybe I'll let you. I don't know if I've faithfully.
Oh, you have absolutely. You have.
I will let you take over from here because it's a really important story, and there's breaking news just this week that it seems as if the Kenyan military, with support of the African Union mission in Somalia, has routed Al-Shabaab from one of its last big strongholds in the coastal town of Kismayo. So there's actually a whole lot going on here, and I wanted to talk about this with you a little bit. So I'll let you give us, your general thoughts.
Well, Mark, you're absolutely right about what superficially was the cause of the Kenyan incursion into Somalia. People from Somalia, we assumed they were Al-Shabaab militias, would come by night, kidnap tourists, kill one on sight, and take them back. And this was part of what they had been done for a long time, which is taking of hostages. Usually it was, of course, hostages on a ship that was passing by, and then demanding a ransom. And in this case, it struck at the heart of the Kenyan economy. Like most developing countries, the Kenyan economy is essentially agriculture and tourism. I'm told it's much the same in the poorer countries of South America and so on. So anything which discourages tourists from coming here and spending their dollars or their euros or their British pounds is a huge blow to the Kenyan economy. But I think that was just the justification. For a long time, Kenya had been uneasy about Al-Shabaab because they were actively recruiting within Kenya. And not just within Kenya, of course. There were people coming to Kenya from places as far afield as Canada and Sweden and the US. Young men of ethnic Somali origin whose families, at great expense, or maybe not expense, but great effort and great humiliation, had managed to come to the West as legitimate refugees. And then a generation later, their children want to come back and fight jihad in Somalia. So that was very puzzling. But there were even more Kenyans, young Kenyans, being radicalized by imams and sheikhs here in Kenya, who are also crossing the border and training to be jihadis. So that had been a cause of concern. And, of course, there was the occasional grenade tossed here and there, but no major attack. Kenya has had no major terrorist attack since the Israeli-owned hotel on the coast. If I remember the year correctly, it would be something like 2000, 2001. I forget the exact date.
Yeah.
So I think we had learned to live with it, just like Britain for long used to have attacks by the IRA, but so long as they're low level, people learn to live with it. But why then would the capturing of tourists be a different thing? Because this now struck at our economy. And this was not the same as a random grenade thrown into a crowd where people could say it was maybe someone pretending to be Al-Shabaab and taking out his business rival or something. Mm-hmm. So Kenya moves in. Now here's the interesting thing. Of course, I'm not pretending to be an expert on warfare, but I know that victory often lies with whoever has a stronger air force. The Somalis had no air force. So for the first time, there was a strong air force presence. And we used to get these news reports from the military spokesman. 40 Al-Shabaab militiamen were killed on this location when the Kenya Air Force dropped a bomb on them. So the question was, how did you know they were Al-Shabaab militiamen? You may be sure you killed 40 people. You may even be sure they were all men. There were no women and children. But how can you know that was an Al-Shabaab training camp? And that sort of report used to come all the time. So though we don't write it much, among journalists we assume that there was U.S. satellite intelligence guiding these efforts, and that Kenyans been fighting on the ground, but somewhere above Somalia there's a lot of intelligence being gathered by U.S. satellites. That's why the Kenyans could move with such certainty, with such precision, with relatively few losses. In fact, the biggest loss was a Kenyan helicopter which, as it was taking off, blew up right here in Kenya. That was the biggest loss. The Al-Shabaab have never brought down any of our aircraft. They've never brought down any of our helicopters, unless, of course, the military spokesmen are deceiving us. We can't be sure. So all I'm saying is...
And, the U.S. is not... they don't hide the fact that they are... that they have operations in the Horn of Africa. There's a big U.S. Not a big base, but there's a U.S. base in Djibouti,
Yes.
Where a lot of sort of their sort of counter Al-Shabaab efforts are located.
Yes, but you're not going to get a Kenyan military spokesman to admit to you that you're working closely with Djibouti.
No.
They talk as though they did everything
Sure.
on their own.
Yeah. So what about the current state of Al-Shabaab? So because one of the Kenyan Air Force, as you said, and two, the gains in the African Union force called AMISOM, which had previously just pretty much been located to Mogadishu. They've been making some gains. The Kenyan military has been making some gains. Meanwhile, the government of Somalia is no longer a transitional government. It's actually formed its first real government in like 2 decades. And so there is progress, at least from where I sit, on the political front as well as on the military side of things. And it looks like Al-Shabaab is on the serious retreat right now. Is that the sense that you have? From the region?
Yes, and for 2 reasons, which you haven't mentioned, which I shall mention. Number one, bear in mind that Ethiopia, back in, I think, 2006 or 2005, did more or less what Kenya did. They invaded Somalia, and they overran all resistance all the way to Mogadishu. And that was a longer distance, I think, than the distance the Kenyan army has moved. So taking ground in Somalia has never been the real issue. The real issue is, after you've taken that ground, can you hold it against the, I'd say, terrorist attack, the suicide attacks, and so forth, which are bound to come. Mm-hmm. So the assumption is that there are very many of these Al-Shabaab militiamen or jihadis who survived the taking of Kismayu, and are they going to sit idle, or are they going to run away, or are they preparing suicide attacks? And if they do launch suicide attacks, will the Kenyan army overreact? Because this is where the problem comes in. And this, is, I remember, happened in Sri Lanka, where the Tamil Tigers, when they were cornered, more or less forced the Sri Lankan army into committing atrocities. You know, they commit atrocities against the armed men, and the conventional army, and the conventional army overreacts. And before you know it, top military commanders of a country are being asked to account for what really happened in that war. So we are actually in the most dangerous phase. What we've done up to this point is more or less what Ethiopia did about 7-8 years ago, with very few losses. They had tanks, they had an air force, they just ran over the landscape in Somalia. But can they hold it? Because the Ethiopians eventually retreated. And that's the same question now. Will this so-called government, and I say so-called because this may surprise, but for a long time, Somalia has had a president. For many years now, but he lived in Kenya. You know, he lived on a compound which was protected by Kenyans. He flew the Somali flag. He met foreign visitors, including from America. But Somalia was too dangerous for him. Mogadishu was too dangerous for him. So can a Somali president drive through the streets of Mogadishu without being blown up the first time he tries it? Until you see something of that sort, I'd say Somalia isn't settled at all. And not just that, but the Kenyans, I think, something which has been overlooked, when we first invaded Somalia, on Twitter and on their blogs and even on YouTube in some cases, the spokesman for the Al-Shabaab asked us, what do you Kenyans think you're doing? You are used to peace, we are used to war. You have very many inviting targets. You have such tall, beautiful buildings in Nairobi. Watch and see how many of those you're going to bring down now that you have dared cross your border into our sacred land. Do you know how many jihadis you have hidden among your ranks, etc., etc.? So there was an expectation that there would be at least one bombing of the Paradise Hotel. That's the Israeli-owned hotel on the south coast, or owned by an Israeli citizen anyway. If not on the same scale as a bombing of the U.S. Embassy. We thought there'd be at least 1 or 2 truck bombs driven into a high-rise building. And the question was, how then will the ordinary Kenyan react? The people might well say, we don't care if they kill 2 tourists. Let us never have another tourist, but we can't have them killing us right here in our capital city. And all we've seen is random grenade attacks, very low-level attacks, which sometimes have killed policemen when they are thrown into a passing lorry full of policemen or something. But these are guys who used to bring down entire buildings. They used to attack foreign embassies. They used to attack hotel complexes. Now they are tossing grenades on the street and running away. I think Al-Shabaab, for whatever reason, maybe in infighting or something, had seriously lost their capacity to wage terror attacks in Kenya. Now,
So you don't think that the other shoe is just waiting to drop, that something big is almost inevitably around the corner? You think that they're capacity has been depleted?
Well, of course, I can't claim to know their plans, but the question is, we've been in Somalia and we've been kicking them about for several months now. Why haven't they done anything? What strategic benefit is there in waiting until Kismayo, your last holdout, the last city they controlled, is taken, and then you bomb? Why didn't they bomb earlier? I think if they could have harmed us, they would have harmed us long before now. If they had the means to bring down a big building in Nairobi, they'd have brought it down. And I'll tell you one theory which some journalists believe in, is that the time they were recruiting Kenyans to go there, a number of the Kenyans they recruited were actually going there to spy on them. They were actually employed by Kenyan intelligence. The reason for this is every now and then there'd be a report that, some, what would they call them? Some traitors have been found. One of the recruits was found with a satellite phone. How could you possibly have had a satellite phone all this time and you're one of us? You must be a spy. And of course, they'd behead him and put it on certain websites and so on. So some of those people must have been feeding information to Kenyan intelligence. I think there was plenty of Kenyan human intelligence on the ground. And I think even within Kenya, their terror cells which are supposed to launch the attacks against us, I think Kenyan intelligence had people in there. It's just like I read some time ago of someone in the US who, it isn't clear whether he was a real terrorist or not, but the bomb-making materials, he bought them from the FBI. So it means they were on to him all along. Yeah. Yes. I think something similar happened here. Mark, you cannot tell me that if the Al-Shabaab, who are controlling Somalia, terrorizing everyone, imposing Sharia, owning the place, if they had the means to attack Kenya in a way which would make us think twice about the invasion, that they would have held off for months for some strategic reason. If they haven't done it, it's because they have not been able to do it. I'm not saying they won't acquire the capacity tomorrow. And as you may know, the bomb which was used against the U.S. Embassy, the tragic bombing of, I think it was 1998? I can't remember.
98.
It was foreigners. Someone flew in from Pakistan, someone flew in from where, the bomb maker came in from somewhere. So it's possible for international terror to launch an attack without using a single local, other than a few sympathizers to hide them. They'll bring in the material from outside, they'll bring in the bomb maker from outside, they'll bring in the suicide bomber from outside. So we may have, our Kenyan intelligence may know what the Al-Shabaab are up to here. But that doesn't rule out outsiders coming in here and bombing us to teach us a lesson and to tell us next time don't think about invading Somalia. So there could be a bombing, but if it happens, I don't think it's Al-Shabaab. They would have hit us long before now.
I wanted to ask you maybe to wrap this up or conclude about the I guess perception of the refugee situation. Kenya hosts the world's largest refugee camp in Dadaab, which is near the Somali border, and there are several 100,000 refugees in Kenya, mostly from Somalia. This is a big sort of, at least on the UN agenda, sort of the humanitarian relief operations in Dadaab and other sort of refugee camps are a huge priority. What's the, I guess, local perception of this refugee population, and is it something that people talk about, worry about, are concerned for?
No, they don't think or talk about it much because the refugee camps are very far from the places with the bulk of Kenyan's population. It's in the north of the country, the Somali border, in an area where most of the people are Kenyan citizens, but ethnic Somalis. The borders of most African countries are drawn very randomly, same as I believe in the Middle East by the British imperial government. So in the days when they had a huge empire. So people don't think about it much. And even in Kenya, the bulk of ethnic Somalis live in a place called Eastleigh. And it's a place you go to do business, but it's like the Chinatowns in some big American cities. Most of the people speak their own language, they know each other. But here's an interesting thing about refugees taking things into their own hands. We had a census about 2 years ago, and the results showed a dramatic increase in the number of Kenyan Somalis living in northern Kenya. And the increase was so big that initially they refused to release the numbers, and then they said, look, the only way the population of this area rises by so much in 10 years, we have a census every 10 years roughly, is if each woman had 8 children and they all survived. And this is one of the places neglected, I think very tragically, by the Kenyan government. This is one of the marginalized areas where there's a very high infant mortality rate, very high. And this is also one of the areas where young people die, in early youth and so on. So it's virtually impossible that any woman should have 8 children. The 8 children is possible because they don't practice any birth control. But it's impossible 8 children should survive if a woman had them. So it was pretty obvious that Kenya, being a country where corruption is tragically very common, especially petty corruption, policemen take bribes, junior government officers take bribes. Obviously, some of the Somalis originally from Somalia had decided that my country is never going to be a safe place. For $1,000 I can get a Kenyan ID, illegally. Why don't I just become a Kenyan? And they had become Kenyans and settled there. Because there were about 2 million more people in northern Kenya than our statistics suggested should be there given the population growth rate. So I'm trying to tell you, some of these refugees solve their own problems. We may have a huge refugee population there, all sorts of non-governmental organizations working, the United Nations working, but to a large extent, the refugees are also very active. The other day I went to, I forget which embassy it was, to get a building where there was an embassy office next to it. There were dozens of Somalis waiting. I think it was the Swedish embassy. Dozens of Somalis waiting to apply for exit permits to go and settle in Sweden. They've already got family there and so on. So it's not that there is no problem, but as a nation we don't feel it. The financial burden is borne by the United Nations and the US and other donor nations. And unless we hear of someone who was from those camps captured as part of some grenade attack, and these are small attacks, not the deadly ones of the past. Kenyans are more worried about the election than about any refugee crisis. Plus, we've grown used to it. Before Somalia, there was a large Ugandan population here. In the days of Idi Amin, the Ugandan dictator, we had hundreds of thousands of Ugandans living in Kenya who fled their country. Kenya has been a place of refuge for very many countries. And that's why, going back to what we were saying before, other African countries in the region panicked and they said, if Kenya goes down the tubes, if Kenya becomes a failed state full of roving militias the way DRC Congo is, where do people go, not just for shopping, because they come here to shop just as Kenyans go to Europe or America for shopping, but where would refugees run to if Kenya falls apart? So there was a huge international need for Kenya to restabilize, but as I said earlier, Kofi Annan was the acceptable and very shrewd face of those negotiations. But the force, the threats, which made these two very ambitious and hard-headed politicians strike a deal, that came from the US. And for that we say, God bless America.
Well, with that, Wycliffe, perhaps we'll wrap things up. But that's a useful reminder, actually, about sort of, some people, I think, question the value or the extent of American leadership around the world and how it can be useful. And I think maybe you offered in a good example of the ways in which American power can be put to productive and good use. Well, thank you very much. We should do this again. This was really interesting. Maybe closer to the election this spring.
Absolutely, you must.
We'll talk about as things heat up, because it's, like you said, I think it's crucially important. Obviously, it's important nationally, but regionally and also internationally for the reasons you described. It's something that's, I think, should be high on the international agenda. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.